Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the blood-soaked temples and twisted ceremonies of the Aztec Empire, where human sacrifice wasn't just a religious ritual, it was an entire economic system built on industrial-scale murder. So hit that like button if you're ready for some truly dark history, and let me know in the comments what you think about civilizations that turned systematic killing into high art. Now settle in. Maybe grab something to drink because this one's a marathon. And let's explore together how one of history's most sophisticated societies created the world's first death-based economy. Fair warning, this isn't your high school textbook version of Aztec culture. The Aztec Empire wasn't exactly what your high school history textbook told you. Sure, they built impressive pyramids, developed complex calendars, and created floating gardens that would make modern urban planners weep with envy. But beneath the feathered serpent gods and elaborate ceremonies lay secrets so dark they make medieval European scandals look like community theatre. The Spanish conquistadors weren't just horrified by human sacrifice, they were witnessing the tail end of a civilization that had perfected the art of ritualized terror with the efficiency of a modern corporation and the creativity of a fever dream. Let's start with something the tourism boards definitely don't mention: the flower wars. These weren't romantic conflicts fought over botanical disagreements. The Zokimequizli, or Flowery Death, were elaborate theatrical productions designed to capture prisoners for sacrifice, but with a twist that would make reality TV producers jealous. The Aztecs would arrange with neighboring cities to have scheduled battles, not to conquer territory or settle disputes, but specifically to harvest human beings like some grotesque agricultural project. Imagine if medieval knights agreed to meet every Tuesday at 3 p.m. for a friendly skirmish, except the losers got their hearts carved out on live television. The really disturbing part, both sides participated willingly. Cities like Tlaxcala would send their warriors knowing full well they might end up as the main course at Tenochtitlan's next religious festival. It was considered an honor to die in these choreographed conflicts, which tells you everything you need to know about how thoroughly the Aztec propaganda machine had infiltrated regional culture. Warriors would paint their faces, don their finest feathered costumes, and march off to what was essentially a death lottery disguised as combat sports. But the flower wars were just the appetizer to the main course of Aztec ritualized violence. The real horror show happened during religious festivals, and not just any festivals. We're talking about celebrations that would make Roman gladiatorial games look like Sunday school picnics. Take Xiamelpili, the new fire ceremony held every 52 years. The entire empire would extinguish every flame, destroy household goods, and fast for days while priests performed increasingly elaborate human sacrifices to ensure the sun would rise again. Because apparently, the Aztec sun god had the attention span of a toddler and needed constant bloody reminders to keep doing his job. During these ceremonies, the priests, who were basically professional serial killers with religious credentials, would select the most beautiful prisoners for special treatment. They'd dress them in elaborate costumes, drug them with various hallucinogens, and then spend hours slowly flaying them alive while crowds cheered. The priests had developed techniques for keeping victims conscious throughout the process, turning death into a prolonged performance art piece that would make medieval torturers look like amateurs. The flaying wasn't random brutality, it was specifically designed to honor AZTEC, the flayed lord, a god who represented agricultural renewal through the metaphor of removing old skin to reveal new growth. The priests would wear the flayed skin of sacrifice victims for 20 days, dancing through the streets while the decomposing human leather slowly rotted off their bodies. Citizens were expected to applaud and offer gifts to these walking corpses, because refusing to appreciate a priest's fashion choices could result in becoming the next seasonal wardrobe. Speaking of fashion choices, let's discuss the Aztec nobility's peculiar relationship with human leather. The upper classes didn't just tolerate the wearing of flayed human skin, they considered it haute couture. Noble families would compete to secure the best materials, from sacrificial ceremonies, with the skin of enemy warriors being particularly prized. They'd have the hides specially treated by expert leather workers who had developed techniques for preserving human skin that were more advanced than anything Europeans would develop for centuries. The really twisted part was how they incorporated this into daily life. Noble children would be given toys made from the bones of sacrificial victims, and wealthy families would decorate their homes with human skulls arranged in artistic patterns. The famous zompantli, or skull racks, weren't just temple decorations, they were neighborhood installations. Every major city had multiple skull walls where the heads of sacrifice victims were displayed like some macabre art gallery. Citizens would stroll past these displays during their daily routines, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly well-preserved cranium or pointing out the skull of someone they'd known personally. But the real dark secret of Aztec society wasn't just the scale of human sacrifice, it was how completely integrated it was into every aspect of daily life. Modern estimates suggest the Aztecs sacrificed between 20,000 and 250,000 people annually across their empire. That's not just religious extremism. That's industrial-scale murder with quarterly quotas. Every major construction project required human sacrifice. Building a house. Better budget for a few human hearts to bury in the foundation. Starting a new business. The gods expected a blood payment up front. Getting married. Time to sacrifice a few slaves to ensure marital harmony. The economic implications were staggering. The Aztec Empire had essentially built its entire economy around a death industry. Professional priests, specialized in various forms of human sacrifice, formed one of the largest employment sectors in the empire. There were heart removal specialists, flaying experts, drowning technicians, and burning consultants. Each method of sacrifice required specific training, tools, and facilities. The temples weren't just religious centers, they were death factories with production schedules, quality control standards, and waste management systems. The waste management aspect is particularly horrifying when you consider the sheer volume of human remains the Aztecs processed daily. The Great Temple of Tenochtitlan alone could handle hundreds of simultaneous sacrifices during major festivals. They had developed efficient systems for disposing of bodies, processing blood, and cleaning sacrificial implements. The priests had created what was essentially an assembly line for human slaughter, complete with specialized workers for each step of the process. And let's talk about those specialized workers, because the Aztec priesthood wasn't exactly a calling for the spiritually inclined. These were professional killers who had turned murder into high art. They underwent years of training in anatomy, learning precisely how to remove a beating heart without damaging surrounding organs. They studied the human nervous system to understand how to maximize pain and prolong consciousness during torture. They developed chemical compounds from local plants that could induce specific types of hallucinations, paralyze victims while keeping them aware, or create states of euphoric compliance. The priests were also accomplished actors and performers. Part of their job was to convince both victims and audiences that what they were witnessing was divine theatre rather than systematic murder. They'd spend weeks preparing for major sacrificial ceremonies, rehearsing elaborate choreographed routines that turned death into entertainment. Victims were often drugged into compliance, but conscious enough to play their assigned roles in what were essentially snuff theatre productions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Aztec sacrifice culture was how it affected children. The Aztecs didn't just sacrifice adults, they had specific religious requirements for child sacrifice that make modern horror films look tame. Children were considered particularly valuable offerings because their innocence made them more pleasing to the gods. They had developed an entire industry around breeding and raising children specifically for sacrifice, with orphanages that were essentially human livestock operations. The most horrifying example was the sacrifice of children to Tlaloc, the rain god. During drought years, priests would select the most beautiful children in the empire, dress them in elaborate costumes, and then drown them slowly while crowds gathered to watch their tears. The theory was that the children's crying would invoke Tlaloc's sympathy and bring rain. If the children didn't cry enough during the drowning process, priests would torture them with hot coals and sharp objects to produce the necessary tears. Parents were expected to volunteer their own children for these ceremonies and express gratitude when selected. The psychological manipulation required to maintain this system was extraordinary. The Aztec ruling class had developed propaganda techniques that would make modern totalitarian regimes jealous. They convinced entire populations that participating in systematic murder was not just acceptable, but necessary for cosmic survival. Citizens genuinely believed that failing to provide enough human sacrifices would cause the sun to stop rising, the rains to cease, and the world to end in supernatural catastrophe. This wasn't just religious indoctrination, it was carefully engineered social control. The threat of being selected for sacrifice kept the population compliant, while the honor of volunteering for sacrifice provided a twisted form of social mobility. Slaves could achieve posthumous nobility by dying spectacularly, and impoverished families could gain status by offering their children to the gods. The sacrifice system created a society where death was literally more valuable than life. The economic incentives were even more sinister. The Aztec nobility had built their wealth on the sacrifice industry. They owned the temples, controlled the priesthood, and profited from the elaborate ceremonies that required expensive costumes, rare herbs, precious metals, and exotic animals. Major sacrificial festivals were essentially trade shows where nobles could display their wealth through increasingly elaborate death spectacles. The Spanish conquistadors, for all their own brutality, were genuinely horrified by what they found in Aztec temples. Hernan Cortés, a man who enslaved entire populations and committed genocide across the Americas, described Aztec sacrificial chambers as places of unimaginable evil. When Europeans who routinely burned people alive for witchcraft are calling your religious practices excessive, you've definitely crossed some lines. But the conquistadors also recognized the strategic value of Aztec sacrifice culture. They used the horror of human sacrifice as justification for their own atrocities, claiming they were saving souls from paganism while simultaneously enslaving survivors and stealing their gold. The Spanish were perfectly happy to replace Aztec human sacrifice with European slave labor, which killed just as many people but generated better profit margins. The really tragic aspect is how completely the Aztec sacrifice culture had corrupted what might have otherwise been a remarkable civilization. The Aztecs had developed advanced mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and engineering. They built cities that surpassed anything in Europe at the time. Their medical knowledge was sophisticated enough to perform successful brain surgery. They created art, poetry, and philosophy that demonstrated profound human creativity and insight. But all of this cultural achievement was built on foundations of systematic murder. The same engineers who designed magnificent temples also calculated optimal drainage systems for sacrificial blood. The mathematicians who tracked celestial movements also computed quotas for human sacrifice. The artists who created beautiful sculptures also carved elaborate torture devices. It was a civilization that had achieved remarkable heights while simultaneously plumbing the depths of human depravity. The psychological effect on Aztec society was devastating in ways that don't become apparent until you examine the details of daily life. Citizens lived in constant fear of being selected for sacrifice, but also in constant pressure to demonstrate their religious devotion by volunteering. Children grew up watching public torture and murder as regular entertainment. Families competed to offer their relatives as sacrificial victims. It was a culture where the most twisted displays of violence were considered acts of piety. The normalization of extreme violence affected every aspect of Aztec society. Their military tactics emphasized capturing prisoners alive for sacrifice rather than killing enemies efficiently in battle. This made them formidable against other Mesoamerican civilizations that shared similar cultural values, but completely unprepared for Spanish conquistadors who fought to kill rather than capture. Their judicial system incorporated sacrificial punishment for crimes ranging from theft to adultery. Instead of fines or imprisonment, criminals were often sentenced to elaborate deaths that doubled as religious ceremonies. The courts would schedule executions to coincide with religious festivals, turning justice into public entertainment. Judges competed to devise increasingly creative forms of sacrificial punishment that would please both gods and audiences. Even their educational system was built around preparing children for a society where ritual murder was considered normal and necessary. Schools taught anatomy alongside arithmetic, not for medical purposes, but so students could better appreciate the skill required for proper human sacrifice. Children learned to identify which organs were associated with which gods, how to read the omens in sacrificial blood patterns, and what types of torture were appropriate for different religious ceremonies. The Aztec merchant class had developed extensive trade networks, specifically to supply the sacrifice industry. They imported exotic animals for ritual consumption, rare minerals for ceremonial weapons, and luxury goods for decorating victims before their deaths. Some merchants specialized in human trafficking, traveling to distant regions to purchase slaves specifically for sacrificial purposes. The most successful merchants were those who could provide the rarest and most exotic sacrificial materials. The agricultural system was designed around supporting massive urban populations that included thousands of priests, craftsmen, and support workers whose entire careers revolved around facilitating human sacrifice. Farmers paid taxes in the form of food that fed sacrificial victims during their final days. Rural communities were expected to provide quotas of human offerings for urban temples, creating a systematic extraction of people from the countryside to feed the city's appetite for ritual murder. The textile industry produced elaborate costumes specifically designed for sacrificial victims. Master weavers spent their careers creating increasingly ornate outfits for people who would wear them for a few hours before being murdered. The costumes were often more valuable than the victim's entire lifetime earnings, representing a massive investment in clothing that would be destroyed along with its wearer. The construction industry incorporated human sacrifice into every major project. Buildings weren't just decorated with skulls and bones, they were literally built on foundations of human remains. The Great Temple of Tenochtitlan contained thousands of human skulls embedded in its walls, not as decoration but as structural components. Construction workers were trained in proper burial techniques for sacrificial victims, and architects designed buildings with specific chambers and drainage systems for handling large volumes of human blood. The medical profession existed primarily to keep sacrificial victims healthy until their scheduled deaths. Doctors specialized in treating wounds and illnesses in people who were going to be killed anyway, developing expertise in pain management techniques that could either minimize or maximize suffering depending on religious requirements. Some physicians focused on keeping victims conscious and alert during extended torture sessions, while others specialized in preparation techniques that would ensure victims died in appropriately spectacular fashion. The entertainment industry was entirely built around death. Musicians composed songs specifically for sacrificial ceremonies. Dancers choreographed routines that incorporated the murder of live human beings, and storytellers created narratives that justified and celebrated systematic killing. Popular entertainment included elaborate theatrical productions where the climax involved the actual death of performers, making ancient Aztec theater literally a life or death profession. The legal profession existed primarily to determine who should be sacrificed and when. Lawyers specialized in religious law that governed the proper selection and treatment of sacrificial victims. They developed complex regulations about which types of people were appropriate for different types of sacrifice, how long victims should be kept alive during torture, and what procedures were required for different religious ceremonies. The most successful lawyers were those who could find legal justifications for sacrificing their clients' enemies while protecting their own patrons from selection. The banking and finance sector had developed sophisticated systems for valuing human lives as commodities. They created standardized pricing for different types of sacrificial victims, with children, virgins, and enemy warriors commanding premium rates. Financial instruments existed for purchasing future sacrifice victims, allowing nobles to invest in death futures markets. Loans were often secured with human collateral, meaning debtors could literally forfeit their lives or their families' lives if they defaulted on payments. The transportation industry existed largely to move people who were going to be killed. Professional slavers developed efficient methods for capturing, restraining, and transporting large numbers of human beings across vast distances. They created supply chains that could deliver specific types of sacrificial victims to temples on precise schedules, ensuring that religious ceremonies never faced shortages of human materials. The food service industry had adapted to support a population that regularly consumed human flesh as part of religious ceremonies. Restaurants specialized in preparing human meat according to religious specifications, and professional cooks developed recipes for incorporating human blood and organs into ritual meals. The most prestigious dining establishments were those that could provide the freshest sacrificial remains, prepared according to traditional religious recipes. The waste management industry handled the massive volume of human remains generated by constant sacrifice. Professional body disposal teams developed efficient methods for processing corpses, extracting reusable materials like bones and skin, and disposing of organic waste. They created industrial-scale systems for handling the logistical challenges of murdering thousands of people annually while maintaining basic public health standards. The education system trained children to participate in and appreciate a society built around ritual murder. Schools taught students to identify different types of sacrificial techniques, understand the religious significance of various forms of torture, and develop aesthetic appreciation for elaborate death spectacles. Advanced students could specialize in areas like sacrificial music, ritual costume design, or ceremonial weapon crafting. The fashion industry created luxury goods from human remains. Skilled artisans worked with human skin, bones, and hair to create clothing, jewelry, and decorative objects for the noble classes. The most expensive fashion items were those made from the remains of particularly prestigious sacrificial victims, such as captured enemy kings or exceptionally beautiful children. The sports and recreation industry incorporated human sacrifice into competitive activities. Athletic competitions often concluded with the ritual murder of losing teams, and spectator sports included elaborate death matches where participants fought to avoid being selected for sacrifice. Professional athletes trained not just for physical performance, but also for the dramatic requirements of potentially dying in front of large audiences. The communication industry developed specialized systems for announcing and promoting sacrificial ceremonies. Professional heralds traveled throughout the empire advertising upcoming death spectacles, and artists created promotional materials that depicted the entertainment value of watching specific types of torture and murder. The most successful communicators were those who could generate public excitement for particularly elaborate killing ceremonies. The insurance industry created policies that compensated families whose members were selected for sacrifice. Premium rates were calculated based on factors like physical attractiveness, social status, and proximity to temples. The most expensive policies were those that covered children and young adults, who were most likely to be selected for high-profile religious ceremonies. The real estate industry incorporated proximity to sacrificial sites as a major factor in property values. Homes near major temples commanded premium prices because residents could easily attend death spectacles, while properties in areas with high sacrifice selection rates were discounted accordingly. Professional real estate agents specialized in helping clients relocate to neighborhoods with lower sacrifice quotas or better access to premium murder entertainment. The Aztec Empire had essentially created the world's first death-based economy where the systematic murder of human beings generated employment, wealth, and cultural identity for millions of people. It was a civilization that had achieved remarkable sophistication while building everything on foundations of ritualized terror. The Spanish conquest wasn't just the destruction of an indigenous empire, it was the dismantling of an entire economic and social system based on institutionalized human sacrifice. The psychological legacy of Aztec sacrifice culture lasted long after the Spanish conquest. Indigenous communities that had survived colonization carried forward cultural trauma from centuries of living in constant fear of ritual murder. Even today, archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the true scale of Aztec human sacrifice, with each new excavation uncovering evidence of systematic killing that exceeded even the most extreme Spanish accounts. The ultimate dark secret of the Aztec Empire wasn't just that they practiced human sacrifice, it's that they had created a sustainable civilization based entirely on the systematic murder of their own people. They had solved the fundamental problems of urban organization, resource distribution, and social control through institutionalized terror that made death more valuable than life. It was a remarkable achievement in human organization, and a horrifying demonstration of how completely a society can normalize extreme violence when it serves the interests of those in power. The Aztecs weren't primitive savages practicing random violence. They were sophisticated administrators who had bureaucratized mass murder with the efficiency of a modern corporation and the cultural integration of a national religion. They had created a civilization where the most educated, artistic, and technologically advanced people in the Americas spent their greatest creative energies devising new ways to torture and kill human beings for public entertainment. That's the real horror of the Aztec Empire. Not that they were barbaric, but that they were civilized. They had proven that human beings could create remarkable achievements in art, architecture, mathematics, and social organization while simultaneously institutionalizing the most extreme forms of cruelty and violence. They demonstrated that civilization and barbarism aren't opposites but can coexist within the same society, with the same people who create beauty also creating horror. The Spanish conquistadors destroyed the Aztec Empire, but they also preserved its darkest secrets in their detailed accounts of what they found in Tenochtitlan. These records provide an unflinching look at what happens when a society normalizes extreme violence, institutionalizes terror, and builds its entire cultural identity around the systematic murder of human beings. The Aztec Empire stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how completely human beings can corrupt their own remarkable potential for creativity and achievement. The darkness that lay beneath the feathered serpents and golden temples wasn't just individual cruelty or religious extremism, it was systematic, institutional, and comprehensive. The Aztecs had created a form of civilization that turned human sacrifice from a religious practice into an economic foundation, from a ceremonial act into a cultural identity, from an occasional ritual into a daily reality that shaped every aspect of life for millions of people. These are the secrets that tourism brochures don't mention and history textbooks often minimize. The Aztec Empire wasn't just another ancient civilization that practiced human sacrifice. It was a society that had elevated ritual murder into high art, turned systematic terror into economic policy, and created cultural achievements that will forever be inseparable from the industrial-scale killing that made them possible. They remain one of history's most disturbing examples of how human creativity and human cruelty can coexist within the same remarkable and terrifying civilization. The administrative complexity of managing such massive scales of human sacrifice required innovations in record keeping that would impress modern bureaucrats. Aztec priests maintained detailed ledgers tracking sacrificial quotas by region, seasonal requirements for different gods, and quality metrics for various types of victims. They developed standardized forms for requisitioning human beings, complete with specifications for age, gender, physical condition, and social status. Temple administrators could tell you exactly how many hearts they needed for next month's ceremonies, which neighborhoods were behind on their sacrifice quotas, and whether the current inventory of victims met religious quality standards. The procurement process was equally sophisticated. Professional victim acquisition specialists traveled throughout the empire with detailed shopping lists of human requirements. They carried standardized evaluation forms for assessing potential sacrificial candidates, rating them on criteria like physical attractiveness, health status, social background, and estimated entertainment value during torture. The most experienced procurement agents could evaluate a crowd of potential victims and select optimal candidates with the efficiency of modern livestock buyers. Quality control was taken seriously. Victims underwent medical examinations to ensure they were healthy enough to survive extended torture sessions. Priests rejected candidates with obvious health problems, not out of mercy but because sickly victims made poor sacrificial theatre. They wanted people who would scream effectively, bleed impressively, and maintain consciousness throughout elaborate death rituals. It was customer service for an audience that expected premium death entertainment. Storage and maintenance of sacrificial victims required extensive facilities. Major temples operated what were essentially human warehouses, complete with specialized holding areas for different categories of victims. Children were kept separate from adults, virgins were housed in special quarters, and enemy warriors received different treatment than domestic slaves. Each category had specific feeding, exercise, and healthcare requirements designed to maintain them in optimal condition for their eventual deaths. The feeding programs alone represented a massive logistical undertaking. Sacrificial victims received carefully planned diets designed to keep them healthy while maximizing their value as religious offerings. High-status victims destined for major ceremonies received premium foods, including chocolate, exotic fruits, and specially prepared meats. Lower-tier victims got basic rations sufficient to maintain health without unnecessary expense. Temple kitchens employed professional nutritionists, whose job was calculating optimal caloric intake for people who were going to be killed. Exercise programs ensured victims remained physically attractive until their sacrifice dates. Professional trainers worked with prisoners to maintain muscle tone, cardiovascular health, and general physical appearance. The most valuable victims underwent daily fitness routines designed to keep them looking their best for public death spectacles. It was essentially a twisted version of modern personal training, except the ultimate goal was looking good while being murdered. Healthcare for sacrificial victims was more advanced than what many free citizens received. Temple medical staff specialized in treating injuries and illnesses in people who needed to be kept healthy until their scheduled deaths. They developed expertise in rapid healing techniques, pain management that could be adjusted for ceremonial requirements, and medical procedures that could repair damage without affecting the victim's value as religious offerings. Psychological preparation of victims involved sophisticated manipulation techniques that would make modern cult leaders envious. Professional counselors worked with sacrificial candidates to achieve the proper mental state for their deaths. They used combinations of drugs, hypnosis, religious indoctrination, and psychological pressure to create victims who would cooperate with their own murders. The most skilled psychological manipulators could convince people that being tortured to death was actually a privilege and honor. The drug preparation industry supported sacrifice operations with an extensive pharmacological toolkit. AZTEC chemists had identified dozens of plant-based compounds that could induce specific psychological and physical states in victims. They could make people euphoric and compliant, paranoid and terrified, or conscious and hypersensitive to pain, depending on ceremonial requirements. Some ceremonies required victims who were alert and aware throughout extended torture, while others called for drugged compliance that made the killing process smoother. Costume and makeup departments employed hundreds of specialists whose job was making sacrificial victims look appropriately dramatic for their deaths. Master artists worked with human canvases who would be destroyed along with their artwork, creating elaborate painted designs, feathered headdresses, and jewelry that would be ruined by blood and torn apart during torture. The most talented costume designers could transform ordinary prisoners into visually stunning sacrificial offerings that enhanced the theatrical value of their murders. Performance training prepared victims for their roles in sacrificial ceremonies. Professional acting coaches worked with people who were going to die, teaching them how to scream effectively, when to beg for mercy, and how to play their parts in elaborate death dramas. Some ceremonies required victims to deliver specific lines or perform particular actions during their torture and murder. It was method acting taken to its logical extreme, where the final performance was literally the performer's last act. The timing and scheduling of sacrifices required mathematical precision that would challenge modern project managers. Major religious festivals involved hundreds of coordinated deaths that needed to occur at specific astronomical moments, during particular weather conditions, and in precise sequences that honored different gods in the proper order. Temple administrators used complex calendars that tracked multiple overlapping time cycles to ensure that sacrifices occurred at optimal moments for maximum religious effectiveness. Transportation of victims to sacrifice sites involved elaborate processions that were part parade, part funeral march, and part theatrical performance. Professional parade organizers choreographed movements of hundreds of doomed prisoners through city streets, timing their arrival at temples to coincide with astronomical events and musical performances. Citizens lined the routes to watch these death marches, throwing flowers and shouting encouragement to people who were walking to their own executions. Music and sound design for sacrificial ceremonies required specialized instruments and professional performers who could maintain appropriate rhythms during extended torture sessions. Musicians developed expertise in playing drums, flutes, and other instruments while human beings were being dismembered nearby. They created soundtracks for death that could mask screams when necessary or amplify them for dramatic effect, depending on ceremonial requirements. The cleanup operations after major sacrificial ceremonies rival modern disaster response logistics. Professional sanitation teams worked with industrial-scale blood removal, organ disposal, and site restoration. They had developed efficient techniques for cleaning sacrificial altars, removing human remains from public areas, and restoring temple spaces for the next round of ceremonies. The most experienced cleanup crews could process the aftermath of mass murder with the efficiency of modern crime scene specialists. Accounting and financial tracking of sacrifice operations required sophisticated bookkeeping that monitored costs, revenues, and resource allocation across the death industry. Temple accountants tracked expenses for victim procurement, facility maintenance, staff salaries, and ceremonial supplies against revenues from religious donations, tourism, and sales of sacrificial byproducts. They could provide detailed cost-benefit analyses of different types of sacrificial ceremonies and optimize resource allocation for maximum religious and economic impact. The training programs for priests and support staff represented one of the ancient world's most comprehensive professional education systems. Students learned anatomy, pharmacology, psychology, performance arts, project management, and customer service skills necessary for careers in the sacrifice industry. Advanced coursework covered specialized topics like optimal torture techniques, crowd management during mass executions, and quality control for religious murder operations. Career advancement opportunities in the sacrifice industry created professional development paths that would be familiar to modern corporate employees. Entry-level positions included victim preparation, facility maintenance, and crowd control during ceremonies. Mid-level careers involved victim procurement, ceremonial planning, and sacrifice execution. Senior positions included temple administration, ceremonial design, and strategic planning for empire-wide sacrifice operations. The most successful professionals could advance to executive positions overseeing entire regional sacrifice programs. Professional associations existed for various specializations within the sacrifice industry. The Guild of Heart Removers maintained standards for cardiac extraction techniques and certified practitioners in proper organ harvesting procedures. The Association of Victim Preparers established quality standards for pre-sacrifice conditioning and professional development programs for psychological manipulation specialists. The Society of Ceremonial Designers created industry standards for torture choreography and theatrical death production. Research and development programs continuously improved sacrifice technology and techniques. Experimental torture methods were tested on volunteer victims to develop more effective ways of maximizing pain, prolonging consciousness, and creating visually impressive deaths. Technological innovations included improved surgical instruments for organ removal, more efficient restraint systems for uncooperative victims, and architectural designs that optimized acoustics for screaming and blood drainage for mass executions. The international trade networks that supplied the sacrifice industry connected the Aztec Empire to resources across Mesoamerica and beyond. Professional traders specialized in importing exotic animals for ceremonial consumption, rare minerals for religious weapons, and luxury goods for decorating high-value victims. The most successful merchants were those who could provide unique sacrificial materials that distinguished their ceremonies from routine domestic murder operations. Quality assurance programs ensured that sacrifice operations met religious standards and customer expectations. Professional inspectors evaluated ceremonial preparations, victim conditioning, and execution techniques to ensure compliance with established protocols. They issued certificates of religious compliance for properly conducted sacrifices and provided recommendations for improving future ceremonies. The most prestigious temples competed for quality awards recognizing excellence in organized murder. Customer service programs catered to noble families and religious tourists who attended sacrificial ceremonies as entertainment. Professional hosts helped visitors select optimal viewing positions for different types of torture, provided explanatory materials about religious significance of various murder techniques, and arranged premium access to exclusive execution events. The most successful ceremony hosts could enhance the customer experience of watching human beings being tortured to death. Marketing and promotion departments developed advertising campaigns to build public enthusiasm for upcoming sacrificial events. Professional marketers created promotional materials highlighting unique features of specific ceremonies, such as particularly attractive victims, innovative torture methods, or rare religious significance. They organized advanced publicity campaigns that built anticipation for major death spectacles and managed public relations for the sacrifice industry's reputation. The architectural innovations required to accommodate industrial-scale human sacrifice influenced building design throughout the empire. Professional architects specialized in creating spaces optimized for mass murder, including drainage systems for large volumes of blood, acoustics that amplified screams for audience entertainment, and sightlines that provided optimal viewing angles for torture spectacles. The most innovative designs incorporated multiple sacrifice areas that could operate simultaneously during major festivals. Legal frameworks governed every aspect of sacrifice operations, from victim selection procedures to ceremonial protocols to waste disposal regulations. Professional lawyers specialized in sacrifice law, helping temples navigate complex regulations about religious murder while protecting them from liability issues. They drafted contracts for victim procurement, negotiated agreements with regional suppliers, and provided legal counsel about compliance with imperial sacrifice standards. Insurance programs protected investors in sacrifice operations against various risks, including victim escape, ceremonial accidents, and natural disasters that could disrupt planned executions. Professional risk assessors evaluated sacrifice facilities for safety hazards, victim security protocols, and emergency response capabilities. The most comprehensive policies covered financial losses from cancelled ceremonies, damaged facilities, and injured staff members. The environmental impact of industrial-scale human sacrifice required waste management systems that could handle massive quantities of human remains without creating public health hazards. Professional waste disposal specialists developed techniques for processing organic matter from mass executions, recycling usable materials like bones and skin, and disposing of contaminated materials that couldn't be reused. They created environmental management systems that could sustain long-term sacrifice operations without overwhelming local ecosystems. The social service programs that supported families of sacrificial victims provided compensation and assistance to survivors of the death industry. Professional counselors helped relatives cope with the loss of family members to religious murder, while financial advisors managed compensation payments for families whose sacrifice contributions were particularly valuable to temple operations. The most comprehensive programs included job placement services for survivors and educational opportunities for children whose parents had been sacrificed. Technology transfer programs shared sacrifice innovations between different regions of the empire, ensuring that advances in murder techniques and ceremonial management could benefit temple operations throughout Aztec territory. Professional consultants traveled between cities, providing training in new torture methods, facility management techniques, and victim preparation protocols. The most successful technology transfer resulted in standardized sacrifice operations that maintained quality standards across the entire empire. The diplomatic implications of sacrifice operations affected international relations throughout Mesoamerica. Professional diplomats negotiated treaties that included provisions for prisoner exchange, sacrifice quotas, and ceremonial cooperation between different political entities. Some international agreements specifically addressed the trade in human beings for religious purposes, establishing protocols for cross-border victim procurement and shared sacrificial ceremonies that strengthened political alliances. Historical documentation of sacrifice operations created extensive archives that recorded details of ceremonial planning, execution techniques, and operational results. Professional scribes maintained detailed records that could be used to evaluate the effectiveness of different murder methods, track resource consumption across various types of ceremonies, and document innovations in torture technology. The most comprehensive historical records provided data analysis that informed strategic planning for future sacrifice operations. The ultimate legacy of Aztec sacrifice culture wasn't just the immediate horror of systematic murder. but the demonstration that human beings can create remarkably sophisticated civilizations while institutionalizing the most extreme forms of organized cruelty. They proved that technological advancement, artistic achievement, and social organization can coexist with systematic terror, that the same people who create beauty can also perfect techniques for causing suffering, and that civilization itself can become a tool for organizing violence rather than preventing it. The Aztec Empire remains history's most comprehensive example of how completely human societies can normalize extreme violence when it serves the interests of those in power, how efficiently terror can be systematized when it becomes economically valuable, and how thoroughly cruelty can be institutionalized when it provides cultural identity and social cohesion. They created a civilization that was simultaneously one of the ancient world's greatest achievements and one of humanity's most horrifying failures, proving that human potential for both creation and destruction can reach extraordinary heights within the same society, the same institutions, and sometimes even the same individuals who shaped this remarkable and terrible empire.